I was born into a wealthy family in Benson, a small town in northern England. I was the younger of two daughters, and we had no other siblings. My sister, Emma, was 6 years older than me. Because of the age difference, we didn't play together much. By the time I was 12, Emma got married to a man named Mr. Simon. I remember the day of her wedding well. So many guests were laughing, singing, and dancing. But I was sad. She had always been very kind to me, more so than my mother. When she left for her new home in Cambridge, I cried. My parents were strict, and they didn't show much affection towards me. They always had hoped for sons, so they didn't care much about me. About a year after Emma married, we received a letter from Mr. Simon. He said Emma had fallen ill and wanted to return to Benson to be with family. I felt worried about her illness, but was happy that she was coming back. They're leaving Cambridge on Sunday, my father told me, and they should be here by Tuesday evening. Tuesday arrived, and I could hardly sit still. The hours felt endless as I waited, listening for any sign of her arrival. Evening came, and then night. By midnight, the sky was dark, and silence filled the house. I couldn't sleep, so I stayed up, waiting around 1 a.m. I finally heard something, a faint sound in the distance. I rushed from my room and down to the living room, calling, "They're here! They're here!" My father and I opened the door and stepped outside. Peering into the darkness, we waited, listening, and heard it again, a quiet, sorrowful cry. But we saw no one. There were no lights, no carriage, and no people. We stood there, confused. "I know, I heard something," my father whispered. "Yes," I replied. "I heard it too." The next day, a man came to deliver the sad news. Emma had passed away on Sunday night. She fell very ill on Monday and grew worse. She died around 1 a.m. on Tuesday, exactly the time we had waited outside, expecting her arrival. For the next 2 years, I was heartbroken, unable to find joy in anything. I didn't want to talk to anyone or do anything. Mr. Simon remarried quickly, which made me even angrier. How could he forget her so soon? Now, I was the only child of my wealthy family. By the time I was 14, men began visiting our home, hoping to marry me. But I didn't like any of them. When I turned 16, my mother decided to take me to Cambridge, a much bigger city. "We'll meet wealthier, more interesting men here," she said, "and you can find a good husband." In Cambridge, I finally felt a bit happier. I met many friendly people and attended dances almost every evening. Many young men asked me to dance, and I began to laugh and enjoy life again, without always thinking about Emma. But my mother grew impatient. One night, she came to my room. "Do you know Mr. George Miller?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. "He's that older man from Faro." "He's not so old," my mother insisted. "He's from a respected family, and he wants to marry you." I was shocked. "But I don't love him, Mother," I said. "I can't marry someone I don't love." "Think about it," she urged. "He's a good man, and he would be a suitable husband." I sat quietly, considering her words. Mr. Miller was indeed a kind man. While I didn't love him, I enjoyed his company, and he always spoke about interesting things. Unlike my parents, he seemed to care about me. The next morning, I found my mother and told her just one word. Yes. Mr. Miller and I were married the following spring. 2 days after our wedding, we said goodbye to my family and left Benson. After 3 days of travel, we arrived in Faro, where Mr. Miller's beautiful home stood near a river surrounded by gardens filled with flowers and tall trees. Birds sang in the trees, and the sky was a bright blue. Standing beside him, I felt a deep sense of happiness. "Come with me," my husband said. "You must meet Mrs. Edwards. She takes care of everything here." Inside, I met Mrs. Edwards, a warm, smiling woman who showed me around. It was a lively house filled with cheerful singing, crackling fires, and the sounds of cats and dogs. "Now, let me show you your room," she said, leading me to a large brown door. But when she opened the door, I felt a sudden chill. In the corner of the room stood a tall, dark figure. At first, I thought it was just an old coat, but something about it made me feel uneasy. I stepped back, startled. "Is something wrong, madam?" Mrs. Edwards asked. I quickly replied, "No, it's nothing. Just thought I saw something." Mrs. Edwards went pale. "What's wrong?" I asked her. She hesitated, whispering, "When someone sees the black figure in this house, something bad is going to happen to the Miller family." I felt a sense of dread, but decided not to mention it to my husband. I wanted to be happy in my new home. The next day, my husband and I took a walk around the grounds. "I like it here," I said. "It feels more like home than Benson ever did." But he was unusually quiet, and finally, he turned to me, looking serious. "Listen carefully," he said. "You must never go into the rooms at the back of the house or the small garden by the back door. Promise me." His tone was strange, and his face looked tense. I didn't understand, but I promised. About a month later, I had my first encounter with the other woman. I went to my room after lunch to get my hat, only to find a woman sitting by the fire. She wore a black coat, her face was pale, and her eyes, I noticed, were completely white. She was blind. "Excuse me," I said. "This is my room. There must be a mistake." She turned her head slowly and replied, "Your room? No, there's no mistake. I want to speak to Mr. Miller." Confused, I said, "But who are you, and why are you here?" She only replied, "Tell him I need to speak to him." I tried to argue, saying, "I am Mrs. Miller, and I would like you to leave." At that, she stood and in a furious voice said, "You are not Mrs. Miller," and struck me across the face. I cried out, and my husband rushed into the room. I left, but I overheard a heated argument. When he came out, I asked him who she was. He only said, "Forget her," his face pale with fear. Despite his warning, I couldn't forget. Day by day, my husband grew more withdrawn, sitting silently by the fire, lost in thought. One day, he suddenly suggested that we move to another country, perhaps France or Spain. I hesitated, as I didn't want to be far from my parents in Benson. That night, I went to bed early, hoping for rest, but I awoke to a terrible sight. At the foot of my bed stood the blind woman, holding a knife. "If you want to live," she said, "leave this house." Terrified, I managed to ask, "Did Mr. Miller marry you?" She replied, I am his wife, not you. Leave tomorrow, or I will kill you. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I told my husband everything. Who is she? I demanded. His face went pale again, but he said, She is not my wife. You are. I was confused and frightened, not knowing where else to turn. I sought out Mrs. Edwards. As the sun rose over Tyrone, I found myself sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the window. The light poured in, illuminating the dusty corners of my childhood room. It felt like a different life now, one where joy and laughter echoed through the hallways, but the memories were too bright, too painful. I could still hear my sister's voice, a gentle whisper in the back of my mind, urging me to find happiness again. I smiled at her suggestion, touched by her effort to connect. I'd like that, Mother. Let's plant roses and daisies. They remind me of sister. Fanny, my dear, it's so good to see you again, she exclaimed, pulling me into a gentle embrace. I've missed your bright smile. How are you? I'm well, Mrs. McCarthy. Just trying to find my way again, I replied, feeling grateful for her warmth. Remember, dear, happiness is like bread. It needs the right ingredients to rise, she said, her eyes twinkling with wisdom. Come by any time for a chat or a pastry. You know I have a special recipe just for you. Every visit to Mrs. McCarthy's bakery filled my heart with joy. I relished our conversations, and her laughter was like a balm for my soul. The townspeople shared their own tales, reminding me that life, though filled with sorrow, also held moments of joy. Suddenly, I felt a presence beside me. Turning, I saw a tall figure silhouetted against the moonlight. My heart raced as I recognized Lord Glen. He stood there, a mix of surprise and joy evident on his face. Fanny, he asked, stepping closer, is it really you? Lord Glen, I exclaimed, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't believe it's you. We stood there for a moment, words unspoken, emotions swirling around us. Then he reached out, taking my hands in his. I miss you, Fanny. I thought about you every day since you left. My heart soared at his words, warmth spreading through me. I've missed you too. Returning home was difficult, but I needed to find my way again. I understand, he replied, his gaze steady and sincere. But I've realized something. You bring light into my life. I want you to know that. Tears welled in my eyes as I took a step back, feeling overwhelmed. But what about her? I stammered, remembering the blind woman and the dark shadows of his past. Lord Glen's expression turned somber. I cannot forget what happened, but I want to move forward. You give me hope, Fanny. I want to build a life together, away from all this darkness. The sincerity in his eyes melted away my doubts. I want that too, Lord Glen. But how can we be together when the shadows linger? Let us confront the past together, he said firmly, determination etched in his face. I want to take you to Corilla. I need you to see the truth and to understand. A wave of fear washed over me at the thought of returning to that place. But I felt a pull towards him, a deep connection that outweighed my apprehension. If you think it's what we need, I will go with you. The following day, we set off for Corilla. The journey was filled with a mix of excitement and dread. As we traveled, Lord Glen spoke about his hopes for the future, painting a picture of what our lives could be like together. He shares stories of his family's history, of love and loss, and of the blind woman who haunted his past. Her name was Eliza, he said, a shadow passing over his face. She was beautiful, kind, but deeply troubled. We married young, and I thought I could save her from herself. But darkness consumes some people. I failed her, and that failure has haunted me. My heart ached for him. You can't blame yourself for her choices. You deserve to be happy, Lord Glen. When we finally arrived at Corilla, the house loomed before us, tall and imposing. The sight sent chills down my spine. It feels different, I whispered, clutching Lord Glen's hand tightly, like it remembers. He nodded, his grip reassuring. We will face it together, I promise. Stepping inside, the air felt heavy with memories. The walls seemed to whisper secrets, and I could almost hear the echoes of laughter from happier times. But as we walked through the rooms, a sense of unease crept over me. Let's go to the back, Lord Glen suggested, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. As we approached the room he had warned me about, I felt my heart race. Are you sure about this? I asked, anxiety knotting in my stomach. I need you to understand, Fanny, he replied. I need you to understand, Fanny, he replied. There's something in this house that I need to show you. Opening the door to the back rooms, a chill filled the air. Dust hung in the light, and shadows danced along the walls. This was Eliza's room, he said, stepping inside. The room was dark and eerily quiet. I looked around, noting the faded wallpaper and the remnants of a life once lived. A small bed sat in the corner, and an old chest lay abandoned. What happened here? I asked, my voice trembling. Lord Glen took a deep breath. It was a night like any other. Eliza was struggling with her demons, and I was powerless to help her. She lost control. I found her here, and I couldn't save her. Tears filled my eyes as I looked at him, the weight of his guilt heavy in the air. You didn't fail her, Lord Glen. You were just a man trying to love her. He turned to me, anguish evident on his face. But I didn't protect her. I let her down. Sometimes love is not enough to save someone, I said softly, stepping closer. But you have the chance to build a new life now, with me. He looked into my eyes, searching for understanding. But the past is always lurking, Fanny. It's like a shadow that won't let go. Then we will shine our light on it. And I replied, determination rising within me. We will face it together. As we left the room, I felt a shift within me. The past was a part of us, but it didn't have to define our future. Days turned into weeks, and we spent time in Corilla, transforming the house into a warm and inviting place. We painted the walls bright colors and filled the room with laughter and light. With each brush stroke, we painted over the darkness that had once consumed the place. During this time, we shared our hopes and dreams, finding solace in one another. Our bond deepened as we explored the gardens, taking long walks by the river and cooking meals together. One evening, as the